The Mirror Saw Murder, a Miss Marple Mystery. Narrated by Connor from Velvet Clues. Welcome back to Velvet Clues, where shadows whisper secrets and truth hides behind the most ordinary facades. I'm Connor, and tonight I invite you into the world of Miss Jane Marple, where a simple reflection becomes a window to murder, and where the past refuses to stay buried. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. What's the strangest thing you've ever seen in a mirror that made you question reality? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Now, settle in with your favorite evening beverage, and let us delve into a mystery where mirrors tell tales, and the dead refuse to rest. Chapter 1. The Maid's Peculiar Vision. The October morning mist clung to Greystone Manor like an unwelcome guest, refusing to lift despite the strengthening sun. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her spectacles and observed the imposing Victorian mansion through the window of Dr. Haydock's motor car, noting how the elaborate stonework seemed to frown down upon their approach. The house had stood empty for the better part of a decade, its windows darkened and its gardens grown wild, until the recent arrival of its new owner had breathed tentative life back into its halls. "Dreadful business," Dr. Haydock murmured as they navigated the winding drive. "Poor Molly Fletcher is beside herself with terror, claims she witnessed a murder in broad daylight, but there's not a scrap of evidence to support her story." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes remained fixed on the manor's towering chimneys, where wisps of smoke indicated someone was indeed in residence. "And yet you thought it worthwhile to summon me, Doctor. Surely the girl's distress must be genuine, even if her interpretation of events remains questionable." Dr. Haydock brought the car to a halt before the main entrance, where elaborate stone gargoyles seemed to leer down at them with knowing expressions. "Molly's been in my care since she was a child, Miss Marple. I've never known her to fabricate stories or suffer from delusions. If she says she saw something terrible, then I believe something terrible occurred, even if we cannot yet understand what it was." The massive oak doors of Greystone Manor opened before they could knock, revealing a slight young woman with auburn hair and eyes red-rimmed from crying. Molly Fletcher appeared to be perhaps 25 years old, with the sturdy build and practical clothing of someone accustomed to hard work. But there was something in her expression, a haunted quality that spoke of recent trauma, that immediately caught Miss Marple's attention. "Oh, Dr. Haydock," Molly said, her voice trembling with relief. "Thank goodness you've come, and you must be Miss Marple. Mrs. Worthington said you might be able to help me make sense of what I've seen." They were ushered into a grand entrance hall where dust sheets still covered much of the furniture, and the air carried the musty scent of long abandonment. Mrs. Celia Worthington, the manor's new owner, descended the main staircase with the graceful bearing of someone accustomed to managing large households. She was a handsome woman of perhaps 50 years, with silver-streaked brown hair, and the kind of understated elegance that spoke of old money and good breeding. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Worthington said warmly, extending her hand. "How kind of you to come. I'm afraid poor Molly has had quite a shock, and I confess I'm at a loss as to how to help her." They were led into what had once been the manor's morning room, where weak autumn sunlight filtered through tall windows and illuminated the controlled chaos of a house in the process of renovation. Furniture stood at odd angles, paintings leaned against walls awaiting hanging, and everywhere there were signs of the careful work required to restore a great house to its former glory. "Now then, Molly," Miss Marple said gently, settling herself in a comfortable chair and fixing the young woman with her kindest expression. "Why don't you tell me exactly what you saw, and when you saw it?" Molly Fletcher twisted her hands in her apron, her eyes darting nervously toward the ceiling, as if the very walls might be listening. "It was this morning, miss, just after breakfast. Mrs. Worthington had asked me to begin cleaning the master bedroom suite on the second floor, the rooms that belonged to the old owner, Mr. Blackwood, before he disappeared." Miss Marple noted the hesitation in the girl's voice at the mention of the former owner. "And what did you observe in these rooms, my dear?" "It was the dressing-room mirror, miss, that great tall glass in the mahogany frame. I was dusting the chest of drawers when I saw—" Molly paused, taking a shuddering breath. "I saw a man strike another man with something heavy." There was so much blood, miss, and the way the victim fell, I know he was dead before he hit the floor. Mrs. Worthington leaned forward with concern. But when we searched the dressing room, there was nothing there. No blood, no body, no sign that anything untoward had occurred. Dr. Haydock consulted his notebook. I've examined the room myself, Miss Marple. It's spotless, and has been for years by all appearances. The mirror reflects nothing but the ordinary contents of the room. Miss Marple's needles had emerged from her knitting bag, and were clicking rhythmically as she processed this information. Molly, you said you saw this scene reflected in the mirror. Were you looking directly at the mirror when it occurred, or did you glimpse it peripherally? I was facing the mirror directly, miss, cleaning the glass itself when the scene appeared. It was as clear as if I were watching it happen right in front of me. And the men you observed, did you recognize either of them? Molly's face grew even paler. The victim, miss, he looked exactly like the portraits of Mr. Blackwood that hang in the gallery. The same dark hair, the same proud bearing. But it couldn't have been him, could it? Mr. Blackwood disappeared 10 years ago. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their motion. Indeed. And the other man, the one who struck the blow, he had his back to me, miss. I saw only that he wore a dark coat and hat, but there was something about the way he moved. Molly shivered, something familiar, though I can't place what it was. As they prepared to examine the scene of Molly's vision, Miss Marple found herself intrigued by the peculiar nature of the case. A murder witnessed in a mirror, yet no evidence of violence in the physical world. A victim who had been missing for a decade, yet appeared as real as life in the reflection. And somewhere in this maze of contradictions lay the truth, waiting to be unraveled by patient observation and careful thought. The mist was finally beginning to lift from Greystone Manor, but Miss Marple suspected that the shadows within its walls would prove far more difficult to dispel. Chapter 2: Reflections That Should Not Be. The master bedroom suite of Greystone Manor occupied the entire east wing of the second floor, its windows offering commanding views of the overgrown gardens and the village beyond. Miss Marple followed Mrs. Worthington up the broad staircase, noting how their footsteps echoed in the vast spaces, despite the presence of Persian runners that had once muffled such sounds. The very air seemed thick with memories, and she found herself wondering what secrets these walls had kept for the past decade. The Blackwood family lived here for over 2 centuries, Mrs. Worthington explained as they reached the landing, each generation adding their own touches, their own stories to the house's history. When I purchased the property, it came with most of the original furnishings, including all the mirrors and artwork. Dr. Haydock, who had remained unusually quiet during their ascent, paused to examine a portrait that hung in the corridor. Is this the missing Mr. Blackwood? The painting depicted a man of perhaps 40 years, with penetrating dark eyes and the kind of aristocratic bearing that spoke of generations of breeding and privilege. He wore evening dress and stood beside a mantelpiece, one hand resting on what appeared to be a leather-bound ledger. There was something in his expression, a mixture of pride and wariness, that suggested a man who had known both triumph and trouble. That's Edmund Blackwood, Mrs. Worthington confirmed. The portrait was painted just 2 years before his disappearance. He was involved in some sort of financial scandal, I believe. Something about missing government bonds, though the details were never made public. Molly Fletcher, who had been walking silently behind them, suddenly stopped and pointed at the portrait with a trembling finger. That's him, miss. That's the man I saw murdered in the mirror. Miss Marple studied the painted features carefully, committing every detail to memory. You're quite certain, Molly, even allowing for the passage of time and changes that might occur in a man's appearance? As certain as I am of my own name, miss. It was Mr. Blackwood I saw die this morning. The dressing room adjoined the master bedroom through a door of polished walnut, inlaid with mother of pearl. The space was elegant but masculine, with fitted wardrobes lining 3 walls and a magnificent cheval mirror dominating the 4th. The mirror stood nearly 7 feet tall, its mahogany frame carved with intricate vine patterns that seemed to twist and writhe in the shifting light. Miss Marple positioned herself where Molly claimed to have been standing and examined the reflection carefully. The mirror showed exactly what one would expect: the opposite wall with its empty wardrobes, the window with its view of the gardens, and the doorway leading back to the bedroom. There was no trace of violence, no hint of the terrible scene that Molly had described. "The angle is quite interesting," Miss Marple murmured, moving slightly to observe how the reflection changed. "From this position, the mirror captures not only this room, but portions of the bedroom, and even a small section of the corridor beyond." Dr. Haydock frowned as he studied the reflected image. "I don't see how that's significant, Miss Marple. The mirror shows only what's actually there, does it?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Molly, when you witnessed this scene, did the figures appear to be in this room, or somewhere else?" Molly considered the question carefully. "Now that you mention it, miss, they seem to be in a different space altogether, somewhere with panelled walls and different furniture. Not this room at all." Mrs. Worthington looked puzzled. "But that's impossible. Mirrors reflect what's in front of them, nothing more." Miss Marple's experienced eye was cataloguing every detail of the dressing room's layout. The position of the mirror, the angles of reflection, the way the light fell through the window, all of it was being filed away for future consideration. She noticed that the floorboards near the mirror showed signs of having been recently cleaned, and there were faint marks on the wall that might have been made by furniture that was no longer present. "Mrs. Worthington," she said thoughtfully, "might I ask how long you've owned Greystone Manor?" "Just 3 weeks. I purchased it from the estate agents who had been managing the property since Mr. Blackwood's disappearance. The house has been empty all this time, though it's been maintained by a skeleton staff." "And Molly, when did you begin working here?" "Yesterday was my first day, miss," Molly replied. "Mrs. Worthington hired me from the domestic agency in the village. I'd never set foot in Greystone Manor before yesterday morning." Miss Marple filed this information away as well. A house empty for 10 years, a new owner, a new servant, and suddenly a decade-old murder was being witnessed in a mirror. The timing seemed too coincidental to be mere chance. She approached the mirror more closely, running her fingers along the carved frame and examining the silvered surface for any irregularities. The glass was old, possibly original to the house, and showed the slight waviness and discoloration that came with age. But there was something else, a quality to the reflection that seemed almost alive, as if the mirror were holding its breath and waiting for something to happen. "Molly," she said without turning around, "I want you to position yourself exactly as you were this morning when you saw the scene. Show me precisely where you were standing and what you were doing." The young woman moved hesitantly to a position near the chest of drawers, her hands trembling as she mimicked the motion of dusting. "I was cleaning the mirror itself, miss, when suddenly the reflection changed. Instead of seeing myself and the room, I saw those 2 men in what looked like a study or library." Miss Marple watched the girl's reflection carefully, noting how the light from the window created subtle variations in the mirror's surface. There was definitely something unusual about this particular glass, something that set it apart from ordinary mirrors. "Dr. Haydock," she said quietly, "I believe we may be dealing with a phenomenon that requires closer examination. This mirror may indeed show more than it should, but not in the supernatural sense. There may be a perfectly logical explanation for what Molly witnessed, and that explanation may lead us to a truth that has been hidden for 10 years. As they prepared to leave the dressing room, Miss Marple took one last look at the mysterious mirror. Somewhere in its silvered depths lay the key to understanding not only Molly's vision, but the fate of Edmund Blackwood himself. The mirror had seen something, of that she was certain. Now it was simply a matter of learning how to make it reveal its secrets. Chapter 3. The bonds that vanished like smoke. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the library of Greystone Manor, as Miss Marple settled herself among the dust-covered volumes and forgotten newspapers that chronicled the final years of Edmund Blackwood's residence. Mrs. Worthington had given her permission to examine any documents that might shed light on the former owner's mysterious disappearance, and Miss Marple approached this task with the methodical patience that had served her so well in previous investigations. The local newspaper from 10 years past painted a picture of scandal and speculation that had rocked the quiet county. Prominent businessman vanishes amid bond theft allegations, proclaimed the headline of the Medborough Gazette, dated October 15, 1934. The accompanying article provided details that were both illuminating and frustratingly incomplete. Dr. Haydock, who had remained at the manor to assist with the investigation, looked up from a stack of financial documents he had been examining. The amounts involved were substantial, Miss Marple. Government bonds worth nearly £50,000 simply disappeared from the brokerage firm, where Blackwood served as managing partner. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles to read the faded newsprint more clearly. It says here that Mr. Blackwood was expected to provide testimony to a parliamentary committee investigating irregularities in government securities, but he vanished the night before he was scheduled to appear. The official theory was that he fled the country with the stolen bonds, Dr. Haydock continued. His personal accounts were found to be nearly empty, and his business partner claimed to have discovered evidence of systematic embezzlement, dating back several years. From her position near the library's tall windows, Molly Fletcher spoke up nervously. If Mr. Blackwood stole all that money and ran away, why would I see him being murdered? Shouldn't he be living somewhere far away, spending his ill-gotten gains? Miss Marple set down the newspaper and moved to examine a collection of personal correspondence that had been left in Edmund Blackwood's desk. The letters revealed a man under considerable stress in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, but they also suggested someone who was fighting to clear his name rather than planning to flee with stolen property. This letter is particularly interesting, she observed, holding up a sheet of personal stationery dated 3 days before Blackwood's disappearance. It's addressed to his solicitor, and contains a rather curious phrase: "The mirror will reflect the truth when the time comes, and those who have deceived themselves will find their own faces staring back at them." Mrs. Worthington frowned as she dusted a leather-bound volume. What a peculiar thing to write. Do you suppose he was speaking metaphorically about justice being served? Perhaps, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. Or perhaps he was being quite literal about mirrors and reflections. After all, we are dealing with a case where a mirror has shown us something that supposedly occurred a decade ago. Dr. Haydock had been examining what appeared to be architectural drawings of the manor house. These blueprints show extensive modifications that were made to the building during Edmund Blackwood's tenure. It seems he was quite interested in the arrangement of mirrors throughout the house. Miss Marple moved to look over his shoulder at the detailed drawings. The plans showed not only the obvious mirrors in bedrooms and dressing rooms, but also an intricate system of reflective surfaces throughout the house that could, under the right circumstances, create sightlines between rooms that were not directly connected. How ingenious, she murmured. Mr. Blackwood appears to have created a system where one could observe activities in various parts of the house without being physically present. The mirror in the dressing room is positioned to reflect not only the immediate room, but also portions of other spaces through a carefully calculated series of angles. Molly's eyes widened with understanding. You mean the murder I saw might not have happened in the dressing room at all, but somewhere else in the house? Exactly, my dear. The mirror was simply showing you a reflection of events occurring in another location entirely. They spent the remainder of the afternoon mapping the various reflection points throughout the manor, following the architectural drawings, and testing different angles of sight. What they discovered was a sophisticated system that would have allowed Edmund Blackwood to monitor activities throughout his house from several key vantage points. But this still doesn't explain how Molly could have seen a murder that occurred 10 years ago, Dr. Haydock pointed out as they concluded their investigation of the mirror system. Miss Marple was examining a particular passage in Edmund Blackwood's correspondence when she made a discovery that caused her to pause, thoughtful. Dr. Haydock, what if the murder Molly witnessed didn't occur 10 years ago? What if it happened much more recently, perhaps even this morning? The implications of this possibility settled over them like a chill wind. If Edmund Blackwood had been murdered recently, it meant he had been alive for the past decade, hiding somewhere while the world believed him to be a fugitive. It meant the stolen bonds might never have left the country, and that someone had been maintaining an elaborate deception for 10 years. But who would have reason to kill him now? Mrs. Worthington asked. And why would he have returned to Greystone Manor, after all this time?
Miss Marple folded the letters carefully and returned them to the desk drawer. "Those are precisely the questions we need to answer, my dear. But I suspect the mirror has shown us only the beginning of this story. Someone wanted Edmund Blackwood dead badly enough to wait 10 years for the opportunity, and that someone may still be among us." As evening approached and shadows lengthened across the library, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the complex web of deception that surrounded the Blackwood case. The stolen bonds, the mysterious disappearance, the sophisticated mirror system, and now a murder witnessed by a young maid who had no connection to the original scandal. All of it suggested a plan that had been years in the making. The mirror had indeed seen murder, but it had also seen something else: the return of a man who had been presumed dead, and the final act of a drama that had begun with theft and was ending with blood. Chapter 4. Gloves that remember what hands forget. The morning brought Inspector Craddock from the County Constabulary, his arrival prompted by Dr. Haydock's telephone call reporting the possibility of a recent murder at Greystone Manor. Miss Marple observed the inspector's methodical approach to the investigation with approval, noting how he examined each room with the thoroughness that serious criminal inquiry demanded. "The difficulty," Inspector Craddock explained as he tested the mirror angles that Miss Marple had mapped the previous day, "is that we have a witness to murder, but no body, no blood, and no physical evidence that a crime has been committed. Without concrete proof, I can hardly launch a full investigation based solely on reflections in mirrors." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically while continuing her own examination of the master bedroom suite. "Of course, Inspector. But perhaps we might find some trace evidence that would support Molly's account. After all, if a violent struggle occurred recently, it would be nearly impossible to eliminate every sign of it." It was while conducting this more detailed search that Miss Marple made her first significant discovery. Behind the heavy draperies in the bedroom, wedged between the window frame and the wall, lay a single leather glove of expensive manufacture. The glove was men's size, black leather with silk lining, and bore the unmistakable monogram, EB, embossed in gold thread. "Edmund Blackwood's glove," Mrs. Worthington observed as Inspector Craddock carefully bagged the evidence. "But it looks almost new. Surely, if it had been here for 10 years, it would show more signs of age and deterioration." Inspector Craddock examined the glove through the evidence bag. "The leather is supple, the lining is clean, and there's no dust accumulation that would indicate long-term abandonment. This glove was placed here recently, I'd say within the past few days." Molly Fletcher, who had been watching the proceedings with wide eyes, suddenly spoke up. "Inspector, the man I saw being murdered, he was wearing black gloves. I remember because one of them fell off when he tried to defend himself." Miss Marple was already examining the area around the window more carefully when she made the second discovery. Caught on a splinter of the wooden window frame was a small piece of fabric, silk by the feel of it, and dark blue in color, with a subtle pattern woven into the material. "Expensive silk," she observed, holding the fragment to the light. "The kind used for gentlemen's neckwear, or perhaps pocket squares. And this snag is quite fresh. The silk fibers haven't had time to fray or discolor." Inspector Craddock was becoming increasingly interested as the evidence accumulated. "So we have a recently dropped glove, belonging to Edmund Blackwood, and a piece of silk that suggests someone was moving about this room with enough force to catch their clothing on the window frame." Dr. Haydock had been examining the floorboards near the window with a magnifying glass. "There are scratches here in the wood, parallel lines that might have been made by something being dragged across the floor." The search continued throughout the morning, with each discovery adding weight to the theory that violent events had indeed occurred recently at Greystone Manor. In the dressing room, they found faint traces of what appeared to be cleaning solution, the kind used to remove organic stains, applied to a small section of the wooden floor near the mirror. "Someone took considerable care to clean up after themselves," Inspector Craddock noted. "But they missed the glove, the fabric snag, and these chemical traces. Professional criminals usually don't leave such a trail of evidence."
Miss Marple had been studying the pattern of the evidence they had uncovered, and a disturbing possibility was beginning to form in her mind. "Inspector, what if we're not dealing with a professional criminal at all? What if this murder was committed by someone who knew Edmund Blackwood personally, someone who had reason to believe he would return to Greystone Manor?" Mrs. Worthington looked puzzled. "But who would have known he was still alive? The whole world has believed him dead for 10 years. Not necessarily dead, Miss Marple corrected gently. Missing, certainly. But someone may have maintained contact with him during his absence. Someone who knew where he was hiding and why he chose to return now. The afternoon brought another significant discovery when Inspector Craddock's search of the house's other rooms revealed a hidden safe behind a portrait in the study. The safe had been recently opened, the lock mechanism showed signs of fresh use, and there were papers scattered on the floor nearby that appeared to have been hastily sorted through. Government bonds, Inspector Craddock announced as he examined the scattered documents. Bearer bonds worth approximately £30,000, all issued by the Treasury in the early 1930s. These appear to be the missing securities that Edmund Blackwood was accused of stealing. Miss Marple examined the bonds carefully, noting their condition and the way they had been stored. These bonds have been kept in climate-controlled conditions for years, Inspector. They show no signs of having been moved or handled frequently. It's almost as if they've been waiting here at Greystone Manor all along. Dr. Haydock picked up one of the bonds and studied the serial numbers. If these are the stolen bonds, then Edmund Blackwood never fled the country with them. They've been here in his own house for the past decade. Which suggests, Miss Marple continued the logical progression, that Mr. Blackwood never intended to flee at all. He may have hidden these bonds to prevent their theft by someone else, then disappeared to avoid false accusations until he could prove his innocence. Inspector Craddock was making careful notes of all their discoveries. But if Blackwood was innocent of the original theft, why didn't he simply produce the bonds and clear his name? Why disappear and let everyone believe he was guilty? The answer to that question, Miss Marple suspected, lay in understanding who had really stolen the bonds in the first place, and why Edmund Blackwood had felt it necessary to disappear rather than face his accusers. Someone had gone to considerable lengths to frame Blackwood for theft, and that same someone may have finally decided that the time had come to eliminate him permanently. The glove, the fabric fragment, and the recently opened safe all told the same story. Edmund Blackwood had returned to Greystone Manor, probably to retrieve the evidence that would clear his name, and someone had been waiting for him with murder in mind. Chapter 5: Secrets Written in a Woman's Hand. The discovery of correspondence in the hidden safe revealed a dimension to the Blackwood case that none of them had anticipated. Among the government bonds and legal documents, Inspector Craddock found a collection of letters tied with blue silk ribbon, the same shade as the fabric fragment they had discovered snagged on the window frame. Miss Marple examined the letters with careful attention to detail, noting immediately that they were written in a woman's elegant script and dated as recently as 3 months ago. The paper was expensive, the ink was fresh, and the content was both intimate and illuminating. "My dearest Edmund," she read aloud from the most recent letter, "the time has finally come for you to return and reclaim what is rightfully yours. I have maintained the pretense for 10 long years, but I can no longer bear the separation. The new owner of Greystone Manor is asking questions that I cannot answer indefinitely." Dr. Haydock listened with growing amazement. Someone has been in contact with Edmund Blackwood throughout his supposed disappearance, but who could have known where he was hiding? Inspector Craddock examined the letter's envelope, which bore a local postmark but no return address. The handwriting is distinctive, educated, confident, probably belonging to someone of considerable social standing, and look at this watermark in the paper. Miss Marple held the letter up to the light and studied the faint image pressed into the expensive stationery. "Worthington House," she read from the watermark. "How very interesting indeed." Mrs. Worthington, who had been arranging flowers in the study while they worked, suddenly stopped what she was doing and turned toward them with a startled expression. "That's my personal stationery," she said quietly. "I had it specially made when I moved to the area 5 years ago." The implications of this discovery created a moment of profound silence in the study. Inspector Craddock's hand moved instinctively toward his notebook as he processed what this meant for the investigation. "Mrs. Worthington," Miss Marple said gently, "might I ask how long you've known Edmund Blackwood?" Celia Worthington set down her flowers and moved to stand by the window, her composed demeanor beginning to show cracks of strain. "I met Edmund 15 years ago when I was still married to my late husband. We moved in the same social circles, attended the same functions. He was a gentleman of impeccable character, and I never believed the accusations made against him. But you knew he was innocent of the theft charges, Inspector Craddock pressed. I knew because I helped him discover who was really stealing the bonds, Mrs. Worthington replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Edmund's business partner, Harold Morrison, had been systematically embezzling government securities for years. When Edmund uncovered the truth, Morrison convinced him to disappear rather than face charges that would be difficult to prove. Miss Marple was studying the letters more carefully, noting references to specific dates and locations that suggested a long-term correspondence between the two. You've been supporting Mr. Blackwood financially during his exile, haven't you, Mrs. Worthington? That's how he survived for 10 years without touching the stolen bonds. Mrs. Worthington nodded slowly. I sent him money regularly, enough to live modestly in Ireland under an assumed name. We corresponded through intermediaries to avoid detection, but recently I felt it was time for him to return and clear his name properly. Dr. Haydock looked confused. But if you knew Edmund was innocent, why didn't you come forward with this information years ago? Because Harold Morrison threatened to implicate my late husband in the scandal if I spoke out, Mrs. Worthington explained. My husband was ill at the time, and the stress of a public investigation might have killed him. I chose to protect him and help Edmund privately, rather than risk both their lives in a public trial. Inspector Craddock was making rapid notes as the full scope of the deception became clear. So Morrison framed Blackwood for his own crimes, then used blackmail to ensure silence from the one person who could prove Blackwood's innocence. And now, Miss Marple observed, Harold Morrison has presumably learned of Edmund's return to Greystone Manor. The question is, has Morrison already acted on that knowledge? Mrs. Worthington's face went pale. Edmund was supposed to meet me here yesterday evening to plan his public reappearance. When he didn't arrive, I assumed he had changed his mind about coming forward. But if Molly really did see him murdered, the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together in Miss Marple's mind. Edmund Blackwood had returned to reclaim not only his bonds but his reputation, with the help of a woman who had loved him enough to sacrifice her own peace of mind for 10 years. But Harold Morrison, the real thief, had been waiting for exactly this moment to silence the only person who could expose his crimes. Mrs. Worthington, Miss Marple said carefully, I need you to tell me exactly when you last communicated with Edmund, and whether anyone else might have known about his planned return. The answer to that question, she suspected, would lead them directly to Harold Morrison, and to the explanation of how a murder witnessed in a mirror had revealed a decade-old deception that was finally coming to its bloody conclusion. As evening shadows lengthened across the study, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of love, loyalty, and betrayal that had shaped the Blackwood case. The mirror had shown Molly Fletcher a murder, but it had also revealed the existence of secrets that some would kill to protect. Chapter 6. The Partner Who Gained Everything. The revelation of Mrs. Worthington's long relationship with Edmund Blackwood prompted Inspector Craddock to request a thorough investigation into the current whereabouts and activities of Harold Morrison, the business partner who had allegedly framed Blackwood for the bond theft. What they discovered painted a picture of a man who had profited handsomely from his former partner's disappearance. Miss Marple accompanied Inspector Craddock to Morrison's offices in the nearby market town of Medborough, where Morrison, Hartwell and Associates continued to operate as one of the region's most prestigious investment firms. The building was imposing in its Georgian elegance, with brass nameplate and uniformed doorman that spoke of success and respectability. Harold Morrison proved to be a man of perhaps 60 years, with silver hair and the kind of polished demeanor that inspired confidence in investors. He received them in his panelled office with every appearance of cooperation, though Miss Marple noted a certain tension in his manner that suggested their visit was not entirely unexpected. Terrible business about poor Edmund, Morrison said as he offered them seats in leather chairs arranged before his mahogany desk. I always hoped he would resurface someday and explain what happened to those bonds. The scandal quite destroyed the firm's reputation for several years. Inspector Craddock consulted his notebook. Mr. Morrison, we have reason to believe that Edmund Blackwood may have returned to England recently. Have you had any contact with him?
Morrison's reaction was immediate and seemingly genuine. "Edmund, here in England? That's impossible, Inspector. If he were alive and in the country, surely he would have contacted me. We were partners for over 15 years. Miss Marple observed Morrison carefully as he spoke, noting the way his fingers drummed nervously on the desk surface and how his eyes avoided direct contact when he mentioned their partnership. "Mr. Morrison, in the years since Miss Blackwood's disappearance, have you ever had reason to doubt his guilt in the matter of the stolen bonds?" "Doubt his guilt?" Morrison seemed genuinely surprised by the question. "Inspector Craddock, surely you understand that I was the one who discovered the irregularities in our accounts." Edmund had been systematically embezzling government securities for months, possibly years. The evidence was overwhelming. "And yet," Miss Marple continued gently, "we understand that Mr. Blackwood maintained his innocence right up until his disappearance. Didn't that give you pause to reconsider the evidence?" Morrison rose from his chair and moved to the window, where he stood looking out at the busy street below. "Edmund was always a proud man, Miss Marple. Even when caught red-handed, he refused to admit his crimes. I suppose I hoped that his disappearance would at least spare him the humiliation of a public trial." Inspector Craddock had been examining the framed photographs on Morrison's desk, images of country houses, expensive motor cars and formal social gatherings that spoke of a lifestyle well beyond what most investment advisors could afford. "You've done quite well for yourself since the scandal, Mr. Morrison. New offices, expanded clientele, quite impressive growth for a firm that lost its senior partner under such unfortunate circumstances." Morrison returned to his desk with what appeared to be practiced ease. "Hard work and dedication, Inspector. When Edmund's crimes came to light, I had to rebuild the firm's reputation from nothing. It took years of careful management and conservative investments to regain our clients' trust." Miss Marple's keen eyes had noticed something that the others had missed: a small silver-framed photograph partially hidden behind the larger displays. The image showed a much younger Harold Morrison standing beside Edmund Blackwood at what appeared to be a company celebration, both men smiling and raising champagne glasses in a toast. "What a lovely photograph," she observed, reaching forward to adjust its position. "You and Mr. Blackwood look quite celebratory. What was the occasion?" Morrison's composure flickered for just a moment. "I believe that was taken when we secured the government contract for managing the war bond allocations, one of our most successful partnerships with the Treasury." "The same bonds that were subsequently stolen?" Inspector Craddock inquired pointedly. "Among others, yes." Morrison's response was carefully measured. "We handled millions of pounds worth of government securities in those days. The missing bonds represented only a small fraction of our total business." As they prepared to leave Morrison's office, Miss Marple made a point of examining the firm's client list, which was prominently displayed in the reception area. What she saw there confirmed a suspicion that had been growing throughout their interview. "Inspector," she said quietly as they walked back to their motor car, "did you notice that Morrison, Hartwell and Associates now manages the investment portfolios for several clients who were originally with competing firms?" "What's significant about that?" Inspector Craddock asked. "Those competing firms all lost major clients in the aftermath of the Blackwood scandal. When confidence in investment advisors was shaken, Morrison's firm apparently benefited by positioning itself as the innocent victim of a rogue partner's crimes." Dr. Haydock, who had been waiting in the car, looked up from the medical journal he had been reading. "Are you suggesting that Morrison deliberately framed Blackwood to eliminate competition?" "I'm suggesting that Harold Morrison gained considerably more than he lost when Edmund Blackwood disappeared," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "A successful partner eliminated, competitors damaged by association, and Morrison himself cast as the wronged party who heroically rebuilt the firm." As they drove back toward Greystone Manor, Inspector Craddock reviewed his notes from the interview. Morrison seemed genuinely surprised by the idea that Blackwood might have returned to England. "If he's the murderer, he's either an excellent actor, or he truly didn't know about Blackwood's presence here." Miss Marple watched the countryside pass by through the car window, her mind working through the various possibilities. "Inspector, what if Morrison's surprise was genuine, but not for the reasons we assume? What if he was surprised not because he didn't know Blackwood had returned, but because he thought he had already dealt with that problem permanently? The implications of this possibility cast their previous interview in an entirely different light. If Harold Morrison had known about Edmund Blackwood's return, and had already taken steps to prevent him from clearing his name, then his surprise at their questions might have stemmed from concern that his crime had been discovered. "We need to establish Morrison's whereabouts yesterday morning," Inspector Craddock decided. "If he was at Greystone Manor when Molly witnessed that murder in the mirror, we may finally have our killer." But Miss Marple suspected that the truth would prove more complex than a simple matter of establishing alibis. The mirror had shown Molly a murder, but it had also revealed the existence of secrets that had been carefully hidden for a decade. Harold Morrison might indeed be their killer, but the full story of Edmund Blackwood's fate would require more than just placing the right person at the scene of the crime. As Greystone Manor came into view through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the tangled web of deception and betrayal that had shaped this case. Somewhere in that web lay the truth about a murder witnessed in a mirror, and the final revelation of who had gained the most from Edmund Blackwood's supposed disgrace. Chapter 7. The Scarf That Told Its Own Story. The morning's search of Greystone Manor's extensive grounds yielded a discovery that would prove crucial to solving the mystery of Edmund Blackwood's fate. Inspector Craddock had organized a systematic examination of the gardens, outbuildings and wooded areas surrounding the manor, reasoning that if a murder had indeed occurred, there might be evidence that had been hastily concealed in the immediate vicinity. It was Constable Peters who made the find that would break the case wide open. Hidden beneath a pile of autumn leaves in the old potting shed, wrapped in oiled cloth as if to preserve it from the elements, was a gentleman's silk scarf bearing the distinctive monogram, E.B., embroidered in gold thread. Miss Marple examined the scarf with the careful attention she brought to all forms of evidence. The silk was of exceptional quality, the kind that would have cost several pounds and been worn only by a gentleman of considerable means. But it was the condition of the scarf that told the most important part of its story. "There are bloodstains here," she observed, pointing to several dark patches that had soaked into the silk, "and these tears in the fabric suggest it was removed forcibly, perhaps during a struggle." Dr. Haydock knelt beside her to examine the evidence more closely. "The blood appears to be relatively fresh, certainly not 10 years old. And look at this pattern of staining. It's consistent with someone having worn the scarf during a violent encounter." Inspector Craddock carefully bagged the scarf for further analysis, but even preliminary examination supported the theory that Edmund Blackwood had indeed been murdered recently, just as Molly Fletcher's vision in the mirror had suggested. "The killer made an error," Miss Marple observed as they walked back toward the manor house. "He took care to remove the body and clean the scene of the crime, but he overlooked this piece of evidence. Perhaps he was interrupted, or perhaps he simply didn't realize that the scarf had become separated from the victim during the struggle." Mrs. Worthington was waiting for them in the morning room, her face pale with anxiety. "Have you found anything that might tell us what happened to Edmund?" Inspector Craddock showed her the bagged scarf, and her reaction confirmed what they had already suspected. She recognized it immediately as one of Edmund's favorite accessories, a Christmas gift she had given him years before his disappearance. "He was wearing it in the last photograph he sent me," she said quietly, "just 3 weeks ago, when he confirmed his plans to return. He said it reminded him of happier times and gave him courage for what lay ahead." The discovery of the scarf prompted Miss Marple to reconsider the timeline of recent events at Greystone Manor. If Edmund Blackwood had been wearing the scarf when he was murdered, and if the blood was as fresh as Dr. Haydock believed, then the killing had occurred very recently indeed, possibly even within the past 24 hours. "Mrs. Worthington," she said gently, "I need you to think very carefully about who might have known of Edmund's plans to return. You corresponded regularly, but did anyone else have access to your letters or knowledge of your communications?" Mrs. Worthington considered the question with obvious distress. "I was very careful about secrecy, Miss Marple, but—" she paused, seeming to struggle with some memory or realization. "Yes, my dear, my housekeeper, Mrs. Dalton, has been with me for 3 years. She handles all my correspondence, including posting letters and receiving mail when I'm away. She would have known about the regular letters to Ireland, even if she didn't know their full contents. Inspector Craddock made a note of this information. We'll need to speak with Mrs. Dalton. If she had knowledge of the correspondence, she might have shared that information with others, but Miss Marple was thinking along different lines entirely. Mrs. Worthington, when you purchased Greystone Manor, did you use the services of a local estate agent? Yes, Morrison and Hartwell Estate Services. They've been managing the property since Edmund's disappearance. Harold Morrison recommended them when I inquired about purchasing the house. The significance of this revelation struck them all simultaneously. Harold Morrison had not only been in a position to know about Mrs. Worthington's interest in purchasing Greystone Manor, but his firm had been managing the property for years. He would have had access to the house, knowledge of its layout, and intimate familiarity with its mirror system. Inspector, Miss Marple said urgently, we need to examine the estate agency's records of who had access to Greystone Manor in recent weeks. If Harold Morrison knew about Mrs. Worthington's correspondence with Edmund, and if he realized that Edmund's return was imminent, he would have had both motive and opportunity to prevent that return permanently. Dr. Haydock was studying the scarf through its evidence bag, noting details that had not been immediately apparent. There's something else here that might be significant. The way this scarf was torn, it wasn't removed by the victim trying to escape. The pattern of damage suggests it was grabbed and twisted by someone behind the wearer, as if used to restrain or strangle. The image this created was deeply disturbing. Edmund Blackwood, returning to his ancestral home after 10 years of exile, had walked into a trap laid by the very man who had destroyed his reputation and stolen his life. The silk scarf that had been a symbol of better times had become the instrument of his final betrayal. As they prepared to confront Harold Morrison with this new evidence, Miss Marple reflected on the patience required to maintain such a long deception. Morrison had waited 10 years for Edmund Blackwood to resurface, using that time to build his fortune and establish his reputation on the foundation of his partner's supposed crimes. But when the moment of reckoning finally arrived, he had chosen murder over exposure. The mirror at Greystone Manor had indeed witnessed a killing, but it had also preserved the evidence that would ultimately bring the killer to justice. Sometimes, Miss Marple reflected, the truth had a way of reflecting back upon those who tried to hide it, no matter how carefully they constructed their lies.
Chapter 8. The Estate Agent's Deadly Commission. The offices of Morrison and Hartwell Estate Services occupied a modest building on Medborough's High Street, its windows displaying photographs of country properties and elegant town houses that spoke of a prosperous business serving affluent clients. Miss Marple accompanied Inspector Craddock to this second confrontation with Harold Morrison, armed now with evidence that painted a very different picture of his involvement in Edmund Blackwood's fate. They found Morrison in consultation with a young clerk, reviewing property deeds and transfer documents with the methodical attention that successful estate management required. He looked up as they entered, and Miss Marple noted immediately that his earlier composure had been replaced by a nervous energy that suggested their previous visit had not been forgotten. Inspector Craddock, Miss Marple, Morrison said, rising from his desk with forced cordiality. This is unexpected. Has there been a development in the Blackwood matter? Inspector Craddock placed the evidence bag containing the blood-stained scarf on Morrison's desk. We found this on the grounds of Greystone Manor, Mr. Morrison. Do you recognize it? Morrison's face went ashen as he stared at the silk scarf with its distinctive monogram. For several long moments he seemed unable to speak, his hands gripping the edge of his desk until his knuckles showed white. That appears to be Edmund's scarf, he said finally. But how did it come to be at Greystone Manor? I thought the property had been empty for years. Miss Marple had been observing Morrison's reaction with careful attention to every detail of his demeanor. Mr. Morrison, your estate agency has been managing Greystone Manor since Miss Blackwood's disappearance. Surely you would have known if anyone had been staying there recently. Of course I would have known, Morrison replied, but his voice lacked conviction. We conduct regular inspections, maintain the grounds, ensure the property remains secure. No one has had authorized access to the house except for essential maintenance. Inspector Craddock consulted his notebook. According to the records we've obtained from your office, you personally conducted an inspection of Greystone Manor 3 days ago. Might I ask what prompted such a visit? Morrison's composure cracked further under this direct questioning. Routine inspection, nothing more. With Mrs. Worthington taking possession of the property, I wanted to ensure everything was in proper order for the transfer, but Mrs. Worthington had already completed her purchase and taken possession, Miss Marple observed gently. What business would the estate agency have had on the property after the sale was finalized? The trap was closing around Morrison, and he seemed to realize that his carefully constructed lies were beginning to unravel. There were some final paperwork issues to resolve, nothing significant. Dr. Haydock, who had been examining the estate agency's client files while the interview proceeded, suddenly spoke up. Mr. Morrison, these records show that you've been receiving regular payments for property management services throughout the 10 years since Blackwood's disappearance. Rather substantial payments, actually. Morrison turned toward the doctor with undisguised alarm. Those payments were entirely legitimate. Property management is expensive, particularly for a house of Greystone Manor's size and complexity. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. But we've discovered that the funds for these payments came from Mrs. Worthington's personal accounts. She was in effect paying you to manage the property of the man she was secretly supporting in exile. The full scope of Morrison's deception was becoming clear. He had been collecting management fees from Mrs. Worthington, while simultaneously knowing that she was in contact with the supposedly missing Edmund Blackwood. This gave him access to information about Blackwood's plans, opportunity to enter the manor house, and financial motive to prevent Blackwood's return. You knew Edmund was planning to come back, Inspector Craddock stated. Mrs. Worthington's increased interest in the property, her urgency to complete the purchase, her questions about access and security, all of it pointed to an imminent return. Morrison slumped in his chair, the fight going out of him as the evidence mounted. I didn't intend for anyone to be hurt, he said quietly. When I realized Edmund was actually coming back, that he might have evidence to clear his name, I panicked. Miss Marple leaned forward with compassionate interest. What evidence were you afraid he might produce, Mr. Morrison? The original bond certificates, Morrison whispered. I knew he had hidden them somewhere in the house before he disappeared. If he returned and produced them, along with the accounting records I thought were destroyed, he could prove that I was the one who had been embezzling funds. The confession continued to unfold as Morrison's decades of deception finally caught up with him. He had indeed been systematically stealing government bonds, using his position as managing partner to falsify records and redirect securities to his personal accounts. When Edmund Blackwood began to suspect the truth, Morrison had convinced him to flee rather than face false charges, knowing that a missing partner would be blamed for any financial irregularities. I met Edmund at the manor house yesterday morning, Morrison continued, his voice barely audible. He said he had proof of my guilt and was prepared to go to the authorities. We struggled, and he looked at the blood-stained scarf with horror. I never meant for it to go so far. Inspector Craddock was taking careful notes of the confession. Where is Edmund Blackwood's body, Mr. Morrison? Morrison's shoulders shook as he provided the final tragic details. He had disposed of the body in the old well behind the manor house, weighting it down with stones to prevent discovery. The scene in the dressing room had been cleaned meticulously, but he had missed the glove, the fabric fragment, and the scarf that had ultimately led to his exposure. As Morrison was taken into custody, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of the case. Edmund Blackwood had spent 10 years in exile, protecting himself from false accusations, only to be murdered by the very man who had created those accusations in the first place. The mirror that had witnessed his death had also preserved the evidence that would bring his killer to justice, but it had come too late to save an innocent man's life. The truth, as Miss Marple had often observed, had a way of reflecting back upon those who tried to hide it. Harold Morrison had built his prosperity on the foundation of his partner's supposed crimes, but the mirror at Greystone Manor had finally shown the world who the real criminal was. Chapter 9. The Reflection That Never Lied. The recovery of Edmund Blackwood's body from the ancient well behind Greystone Manor brought a somber conclusion to a case that had begun with reflections in a mirror and ended with the exposure of a decade-long deception. Inspector Craddock supervised the grim task while Miss Marple attended to the emotional needs of those whose lives had been forever changed by the revelation of the truth. Mrs. Worthington sat in the morning room of the manor, surrounded by the letters that chronicled 10 years of secret correspondence with the man she had loved and lost. Her face bore the composure of someone who had grieved deeply but was finally able to say goodbye properly. "I always knew Edmund was too honorable to have stolen those bonds," she said quietly, as Miss Marple arranged the last of the evidence that would clear Blackwood's name posthumously. "But I never imagined that Harold Morrison would go so far as murder to protect his own crimes." Dr. Haydock had completed his examination of the body and confirmed that Edmund Blackwood had died from strangulation, exactly as Morrison had confessed. The silk scarf had indeed been used as the murder weapon, twisted tight around the victim's neck during their final fatal struggle. "Morrison's confession has filled in the remaining gaps in our understanding," Dr. Haydock reported. Edmund had indeed hidden the original bond certificates in the manor house before his disappearance, along with accounting records that proved Morrison's embezzlement. He returned to retrieve this evidence and clear his name, but Morrison was waiting for him. Molly Fletcher, whose vision in the mirror had begun the entire investigation, stood near the tall windows looking out at the gardens where Edmund Blackwood had been laid to rest. "I still don't understand how I could have seen it happen in the mirror, Miss Marple. How does such a thing work?" Miss Marple joined her at the window, her knitting needles clicking gently as she worked through a particularly complex pattern. "The mirror system that Edmund Blackwood installed was quite ingenious, my dear. From the position where you were standing, the mirror could reflect events occurring in the study where the murder actually took place. But I saw it happening in what looked like the dressing room," Molly protested. "No, you saw it reflected as if it were happening in the dressing room," Miss Marple corrected gently. "The mirror was positioned to create the illusion that you were observing events in the immediate vicinity, when in fact you were seeing a reflection of actions occurring elsewhere in the house." Inspector Craddock had returned from the well site and was reviewing the final details of Morrison's confession. Morrison admits to entering the house through the kitchen door, using keys he had retained from his years of managing the property. He confronted Blackwood in the study, where they fought over the evidence that would clear Blackwood's name. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The angle of reflection from the study to the dressing room mirror would have shown Molly exactly what she described: two men struggling, one striking the other, the victim falling. The mirror was simply doing what mirrors do, showing the truth of what was happening, even if that truth was not immediately apparent to the observer. Mrs. Worthington looked up from the letters she had been organizing. Edmund wrote about the mirror system in one of his final letters. He said it would reflect the truth when the time comes, just as Miss Marple discovered. "I think he knew that if anything happened to him, the mirrors would preserve the evidence." The investigation had revealed the full extent of Harold Morrison's crimes. Over the course of 10 years he had embezzled nearly £100,000 in government securities, using his position as estate manager to maintain access to Greystone Manor while building his reputation on the foundation of Edmund Blackwood's supposed guilt. "The irony," Dr. Haydock observed, "is that Morrison's success ultimately led to his downfall. If he had been content to remain a modest investment advisor, Edmund's return might not have posed such a threat. But having built an empire on stolen wealth, he felt he had too much to lose." As evening fell over Greystone Manor, Miss Marple found herself standing once again in the dressing room, where Molly had witnessed the murder in the mirror. The silvered glass reflected her own image now, peaceful and ordinary, giving no hint of the terrible scenes it had revealed. "Mirrors never lie," she murmured to herself, remembering the words from Edmund Blackwood's letter. "They simply wait to be asked the right questions." The case of the mirror that saw murder had been solved, but it had extracted a heavy price from all involved. Edmund Blackwood was dead, his reputation cleared too late to matter to him personally. Mrs. Worthington faced a future without the man she had loved and supported for 10 years. Harold Morrison would spend the rest of his life in prison, his stolen wealth confiscated to compensate the victims of his crimes. But justice, Miss Marple reflected, was not always about restoring what had been lost. Sometimes it was simply about ensuring that the truth was finally told, that lies were exposed, and that those who chose evil over good faced the consequences of their actions. The mirror at Greystone Manor would continue to reflect whatever was placed before it, innocent now of the terrible secrets it had helped to reveal.
But Miss Marple would never forget the lesson it had taught, that truth, like light, could be bent and redirected, but it could never be truly destroyed. Given time and the right perspective, it would always find a way to shine through the darkness that sought to conceal it. Chapter 10: When Mirrors Give Up Their Ghosts. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Greystone Manor's morning room, as Miss Marple prepared to take her leave of a case that had proven both tragic and illuminating. The house itself seemed different now, lighter somehow, as if the revelation of Edmund Blackwood's fate had lifted a burden that had weighed upon its walls for 10 long years. Mrs. Worthington was making arrangements for Edmund's proper burial in the village churchyard, where a headstone would finally mark his passing and proclaim his innocence to the world. The stolen bonds had been returned to the government, and the insurance companies that had paid claims on the missing securities would pursue their own legal remedies against Harold Morrison's estate. "It seems fitting," Mrs. Worthington said as she signed the documents that would transfer ownership of certain personal items to the local museum, "that Edmund's mirror system should be preserved as a testament to his ingenuity. Perhaps someday it will help solve other mysteries." Inspector Craddock had completed his final report on the case, documenting the complex series of events that had led from a young maid's vision in a mirror to the exposure of a decades-old fraud. "The most remarkable aspect," he observed to Miss Marple, as they walked through the gardens where Edmund's body had been found, "is how a single moment of reflection, in more ways than one, unraveled such an elaborate deception." Miss Marple paused beside the old well where the tragedy had reached its conclusion. "Evil has a way of becoming more complex over time, Inspector, like a knot that grows tighter with each attempt to hide it. Harold Morrison spent 10 years adding layers to his deception, but in the end, all those layers simply provided more evidence of his guilt." Molly Fletcher had chosen to remain in Mrs. Worthington's service, her traumatic experience having strangely strengthened her resolve rather than breaking her spirit. "I understand now why I had to see what I saw," she told Miss Marple, as they stood once more in the dressing room, with its famous mirror. "Someone needed to witness what happened to Mr. Blackwood, and the mirror chose me to be that witness." Miss Marple studied the young woman's reflection in the tall glass, noting how the morning light created subtle variations in the mirror's surface. "The mirror didn't choose you, my dear. You simply happened to be in the right place at the right time, with eyes clear enough to see what was being shown to you. Many people look without truly seeing." Dr. Haydock had been conducting a final examination of the mirror system, documenting its construction and the principles that had made Edmund Blackwood's ingenious surveillance possible. "The precision required to calculate these angles of reflection is remarkable," he observed. "Blackwood must have spent months perfecting the alignment." "He was a man who understood that truth has a way of revealing itself," Miss Marple replied. "Even from beyond the grave, he found a way to ensure that justice would be served." As they prepared to leave Greystone Manor for the final time, Miss Marple took one last look at the mirror that had started it all. In its silvered depths, she could see the reflection of the room, the windows, the doorway, all perfectly ordinary now, giving no hint of the extraordinary events it had witnessed and helped to resolve. "You know," she said to Mrs. Worthington as they walked toward the entrance hall, "I believe Edmund would be pleased to know that his house has finally found someone who will care for it properly. Greystone Manor was meant to be a home, not a monument to tragedy." Mrs. Worthington smiled sadly. "I plan to restore it completely, and perhaps open it to the public occasionally. Edmund's story should be told, not the false version that destroyed his reputation, but the true story of a man who chose exile over dishonor, and ultimately paid with his life for another man's greed." The drive back to St. Mary Mead gave Miss Marple time to reflect on the case and its lessons. The mirror that saw murder had shown them more than just a crime. It had revealed the power of truth to survive even the most determined attempts to bury it. Harold Morrison had spent 10 years believing he had successfully framed his partner and escaped justice, but the mirror had been waiting all along to tell a different story. "Truth is like light," Miss Marple observed to Dr. Haydock as they passed through the village, where she had spent so many years observing human nature in all its complexity. "It can be reflected, refracted, and redirected, but it cannot be destroyed. Given the right conditions, it will always find a way to illuminate the darkness." As they reached her cottage gate, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to return to the quiet routines of village life. But she carried with her the memory of Edmund Blackwood's tragic fate and the reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed, was never truly denied. The mirror at Greystone Manor would continue to reflect whatever was placed before it, but it had given up its most important secret. The ghost of Edmund Blackwood could finally rest in peace, his name cleared and his murderer brought to justice. And in the silvered depths of an antique mirror, truth had once again proven itself more powerful than the lies that sought to obscure it. That evening, as Miss Marple settled into her favorite chair with her knitting and a cup of tea, she thought about mirrors and reflections, about truth and deception, and about the strange ways in which the past could reach into the present to demand justice. The case was closed, but its lessons would remain with her always, another chapter in her long experience of human nature and its infinite capacity for both good and evil. The mirror had seen murder, but it had also seen justice served. Sometimes, Miss Marple reflected, that was all one could ask for in an imperfect world. Thank you for joining us at Velvet Clues for another journey into the world of Miss Jane Marple, where ordinary objects hold extraordinary secrets, and where truth, like light in a mirror, will always find a way to shine through the darkness. Until next time, keep your eyes open for the mysteries that surround us all, and remember, sometimes the most revealing truths are found, not in what we see directly, but in what is reflected back to us when we know how to look. I'm Connor, and this has been Velvet Clues. Sweet dreams, and may your own reflections always show you truth.